Well, Israel is ordering further evacuations into southern Gaza and expanding their ground operations into the Strip. Israeli defense forces resumed bombing the region after ceasefire and hostage release negotiations broke down last week. The IDF released this map over the weekend, dividing up residential areas into numbered zones, sending already displaced Gazans back again on the roads. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, at least 700 Gazans killed in just 24 hours of renewed bombing in both the north and south. Over 1.1 million people displaced since the war began on October 7th.
Here in the States, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was the first member of the Biden administration to admit the quiet part out loud. Could Israel be creating more members of Hamas?
This kind of a fight, the center of gravity is the civilian population. And if you drive them into the arms of the enemy, you replace a tactical victory with a strategic defeat. So I have repeatedly made clear to Israel's leaders that protecting Palestinian civilians in Gaza is both a moral responsibility and a strategic imperative.
National Security Spokesman John Kirby was pressed further on the matter. Let's watch.
What is the United States prepared to do if it feels as though Israel is not following a specific plan to mitigate civilian casualties? What's the fallout?
That's a hypothetical, and I don't want to get ahead again of where we are right now. Secretary Blinken was very clear. We've been clear actually from the beginning of this conflict.
But will there be consequences, John, if the United States feels as though Israel is not following a specific plan?
You know, again, I don't want to speculate one way or the other, Kristen. I want to make two things clear. One is we're going to continue to support Israel as they go after Hamas. The security assistance continues to flow. That's not going to change.
Meanwhile, protests for a ceasefire continue to take place across the country, including this weekend in front of the California home of former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Protesters reportedly chanted and implored the Congresswoman's support, but they were unsuccessful. NBC News has published a devastating report out of Gaza. Bodies of several babies discovered decomposing in the Al-Nusra Hospital nursery, a hospital that was evacuated in the course of Israel's bombardment of the Gaza Strip.
So, yeah, a lot of devastating news coming out of Gaza over the weekend. The 700 death figure represents the largest single day of deaths in this entire crisis. I saw some people pointing out online that, you know, as the debate continues over whether or not this amounts to a genocide, people are pulling for all kinds of historical comparisons. And that was approximately the number of Jews that was killed on a daily basis at Auschwitz. Some people, many people in this movement, these Jewish Justice Voice for Peace and others, are invested in part because they or their family members survived Auschwitz. And so those kinds of comparisons are particularly meaningful for them. And we continue to see this parallelism where the United States is urging Israel to take civilian casualties into account. The numbers getting up into the 15,000 civilian death number, with a relatively very small number that even Israel is saying are actual Hamas targets that have been hit, seem really disproportionate. And I think that there is an awareness of the way that public opinion is turning against the siege at the same time that it is saying that Israel needs to be more considerate of civilian deaths. The U.S. is continuing to send munitions, including 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs that were sent, the Wall Street Journal reported back on December 1st. And now you have Lloyd Austin, who was hardly anybody's peacenik, pointing out that just from a raw strategic perspective, at a certain point, you are making a strategic blunder if at the end of the day you're creating a whole generation worth of orphans or people who were half the population of Gaza now internally displaced, expecting them not to want to grow up and continue to passionately fight, not just for retribution, but for an end of the occupied conditions that Gazans have been living under for 75 years.
Right. You say decrease in support. You mean in the U.S.? Yeah. I mean, did you see those poll numbers from Israel? The support in Israel for what the government's doing is
overwhelming.
Overwhelming.
But not just the U.S., around the world.
Sure. But my point is, but in Israel, the government feels totally unconstrained by I mean, they're in keeping their actions with public opinion, which suggests to me that there will not be any effort on the Israeli government's part to they don't face pressure, and the U.S. is really saying, while we'd like you to minimize casualties, we're not going to do anything to stop you, and we're actually taking off the table the idea of decreasing your funding. So given that, there's no reason to expect a different outcome.
Which is why I think look, there are some people who say, why are you protesting against Israel? There are many governments around the world that engage in violence against communities or have other kind of political bad practices. Why this? And I think what you just said explains exactly why. America is in the unique position of using its leverage to stop a, whatever you want to call it, a siege, a genocide, and ethnic cleansing on a population that is being literally carried out with our own munitions, and by a country that receives the largest amount of aid, American aid, than any other country in the world. So there really does seem to be an implication, a direct implication of American public policy here, unlike in some other crises around the world. And that is why there's so many direct protests that are happening to Congress members, because there really is, as with so many things in foreign policy, a bipartisan, right-left, corporate, political agreement on what should be happening here. Although it is interesting to see Lloyd Austin and some members of kind of the security state saying, again, just from a strategic perspective, outside of a political perspective, this is a bad idea.
What is a bad idea?
All of the civilian deaths.
Right.
The kind of now.
Well, that's like akin to what Elon Musk said of all people.
Yeah,
which is that you're making the situation.
Yeah, it's what he said before his visit to Israel and a sit down with Netanyahu.
Well, look, I think we should. Frankly, I would have never given the aid money in the first place, so I would be for cutting it off, because I don't think American tax dollars should be paying for the security needs of other countries, even regardless and independent of whether the countries are acting in accordance with what our government is telling them to do. So that is the difference. I would end this regardless, even if they're being a well-behaved international actor. I don't think Americans should have to pay for it. But then the other aspect of this is, so the ceasefires come to an end. Hamas launched a rocket, I think, an hour before it was scheduled to actually end. Hamas has no desire. I mean, these deaths occurring after the collapse of the ceasefire. If Hamas is not going to react to any the widespread the deaths of hundreds of their people, of their civilians, of their group. Why would Israel be expected to act that way?
So there is some debate about who's responsible for ending the ceasefire. Of course, Palestinians were shot out in the middle of the ceasefire. That did not seem to count, killing Palestinians. I think it was in East Jerusalem during the ceasefire. Didn't seem to count. Remember, we covered the story a little bit. No, there was the story of the Israeli authorities in Jerusalem had told Palestinians they weren't allowed to celebrate the return of hostages, and Palestinians were shot, and Israel justified it as saying, well, you broke the rules, you weren't supposed to celebrate the hostages, as though that's a rule that it makes any sense. Regardless, many people felt like that was an abridgment of the ceasefire, not to mention, as you pointed out, that in the West Bank, Israel had captured and re-imprisoned more Palestinians in the West Bank than they had released during the hostage exchange. And again, the issue with that practice is that the majority of Palestinians that have been captured in that way are held without trial, without charges. Some of them are subject to a military trial that does not accord with what our sense of due process is here in this country, or frankly, even in Israel for Israeli citizens or for Jewish Israelis. So people can debate that left, right, and center. But the question is, the stated intent from Netanyahu and other members of Israel's government before the end of the ceasefire was to double down on the siege and be more aggressive and more violent after the ceasefire was over. So blaming it on some act of Palestinian violence in the interim does seem to miss the point that these stated goals repeatedly of Israel here in this moment do seem to militate toward ethnic cleansing. When you look at the maps of where they're telling people to evacuate to, there was a time when they said, go to the south. We've warned you. We've done the bomb knocks on your roof to let you know that you need to evacuate. We're looking out for civilian casualties. Now they're saying you have to go. There's a different map where there's like a tiny sliver at the bottom of Gaza, which they're now saying is a safe zone. And all of the zones that they previously said where people, innocents, could go and flee and be safe are now subject to bombing. And there was this quote about thinning out the population. that made many people say, I mean, how many times do you have to admit that what the goal here is a kind of population decline, ethnic cleansing, or if you will, genocide? That was a quote from Netanyahu saying, I think again over the weekend, that their goal is to thin out, to talk about how much of the population of Gaza you can thin out. And again, not just from bombing, but from the humanitarian crisis, the lack of water. They've run out of food. Obviously, they haven't had medical supplies. Kids are getting amputated without limbs amputated without any kind of anesthetic. I mean, these are the conditions that are really persisting here.